We can read, we can see what has happened in Europe, in our cities, on social media and on television. This is one of the biggest humanitarian crises in 10 years. We can read about the threat of the refugees, how our governments struggle to allocate them fairly. You can even read that Europe is not ready to support them. But we barely hear from the refugees ourselves. Here in Brussels, close to the Gare du Nord, many refugees affected by the Syrian crisis spend their days waiting for the approval of their asylum application. Saleh Shabar is one of them. Now 21 years old, he had to flee the Assad regime last year after being imprisoned for several days. He is unhappy about the media coverage on the crisis.
They are talking that a lot of refugees now in Europe, but really it's nothing. You know, in Turkey there are 2 million Syrians. That Syrian refugees, they don't come to Europe just for economic situation or something like that. Really, we had our life in Syria, we had our own lives, just we lost everything, we don't have any place to stay, just we went to your country just to find safe place, to continue normal life, like any human.
The number of applications in the EU is still relatively low in comparison to Syria's neighboring countries, such as Lebanon or Jordan, where there are around 90% of the refugees. But the 10% of refugees that make their way to the Western Hemisphere are rarely in the news, which raises the question, how important is it to cover personal stories of refugees? Jean-Paul Matos takes a stance on it. He works as a Brussels correspondent for the Committee to Protect Journalists and has been covering humanitarian issues for NGOs as well as for traditional media for over 20 years.
We have to make sure that the discussion that will take place on migration and migration policies in Europe is based on facts and on as many facts that are double-checked and validated as possible.
A valid point, but where does that leave room for the refugees' personal stories? Euronews's James Franny covered the refugee crisis on the ground. He rode the train with the refugees all the way from Macedonia up north.
We've heard enough from people with wearing suits and ties in Brussels. We've heard all that. How was that journey for them? What were they leaving behind in Syria? And I was also asking them, what kind of welcome do you expect in Europe? When you're on the trail with those people, I think it's important to give them a voice because it's not always heard, and that should be the focus of your work.
In the meantime, Saleh Shabar, the 21-year-old Syrian, has other problems. He is waiting for his asylum request to be processed so he can make his dreams come true.
I had many jobs in Syria. I want to be a teacher because I love children, and maybe volunteer too.
If we want it or not, the refugees arriving at our borders every single day are an important factor in Europe's future. By not listening to their stories and by keeping them mute, we will continue to miss out on an important piece in the puzzle.